Here we go. Tonight, we are talking about dual identified students, or we're focusing on the idea of English learners in special education. So, before they get there, on the way to getting there, and once they get there. We aren't going to get into specific policies and practices because that's very different from district to district, but we will talk about big ideas, things to think about, areas to focus on to take back to your school or to your district. All right, as I said, I'm Kelly Ryder. I'm the founder of English Learner Portal, and welcome. I hope that you get some good ideas or things to think about from this evening. On the slide, it gives you some of my background. We began English Learner Portal in 2018 officially, though we were working on some things before that. Prior to that, I started my career as an ESL teacher in elementary school, and over the years had the opportunity to work mostly in elementary school, but also middle and high school across Maryland and North Carolina, where my teaching positions were. I also had opportunity to be an elementary classroom teacher because one of the schools I worked with as an ESL teacher had a long-term substitute, and the people just kept changing. You know how it goes when you have somebody who's out on maternity leave, and it was a new sub after a new sub after a new sub. And I went to the principal and said, "Can I please just have the class? Like, I can't hurt them any more than 10 different subs are hurting them. So let me take the class, and then at the end of the year, Miss Grinsberg can have her class back." And I loved it. So for a couple years, I stayed in the classroom. It was a mostly English learner school, 95% English learner population from Montgomery County, Maryland, which I saw a few folks from there. And so I stayed there for a bit and then became a professional development specialist traveling between schools. Um, then I went into the administrator training program there, became an assistant principal for a few years, had a little bit different role in that capacity. Went to North Carolina, opened a newcomer center for middle school and high school, spent some time there, loved my high school experience also. Went back to Maryland as district ESL coordinator in Anne Arundel County Public Schools, and I am beyond happy and smiling to see one of those teachers in here tonight. So, hey, it's been a long time, and I'm glad to see you. So, as the district coordinator, we took care of issues like this, helping schools decide when is special education appropriate. How do we know? I also traveled with the WIDA Consortium doing training for them for a few years, and then liked that life, that focus, and decided to go ahead and start English Learner Portal to do a lot of the same. So in the work with English Learner Portal, I am also working on with a district on what's called a Rose Grant, where we are working to address the idea of over identification of English learners in special ed. So that's been a very enlightening experience and will continue to be throughout the next school year, working with schools in a feeder pattern to middle schools and their elementary feeders to help them address the issues in over identification. So we'll talk about some of those big ideas here tonight. All right, so first let's talk about some myths, because anytime I go into a school or I'm working with teachers, I hear the same kinds of things, and some of them are what is popular belief, but not really true exactly. And so we want to spend some time talking about those myths and misconceptions because they get in the way of the real work, which is knowing what is normal progress, when something's off, what can we do to address it before we get to special education, and then when is it absolutely necessary. So the biggest myth I hear going to school and talking to teachers is I can't refer this student to special education until they're in the school for at least 1 year. Now, there are some local policies that say nothing really in writing that I've ever seen, but word of mouth, where principals will be told you can't do anything for at least a year, or teachers will be told by the principal, we have to try this for at least a year. As far as I know, there is nothing in federal guideline that makes this true. Now, I think it comes from good intention, right? We want to make sure we are giving students time to adjust. We want to make sure that we are giving them time to just wrap their heads around being in a different country and working in a different language and being in a school system they haven't experienced before, and just give them a little while to show us their best, right? When we make a judgment too quickly, we might not have given them enough time. I do believe that's the intention of these kinds of statements and guidelines. What I want to make clear is that I don't know of anywhere where that guideline is in policy. If we put a timeline on it, we are dancing around the idea of violating civil rights. You in a school need to treat English learners as you would treat any other student who you have concerns about. So the idea that they're an English learner, multilingual student cannot be a deciding factor. If this was Johnny who grew up in the United States and only speaks English, then what would you do? Yes, we need to take into account that they need some time to adjust. But if you see a pattern of concern or concerns that your experience tells you, this isn't what I'm used to, this doesn't seem quite right, then that is worth investigating right away. Because the longer we fail to identify a concern or address a concern, the bigger the gap gets. So if you hear someone talk about the time frame, then think about that conversation of how you would address that and say, what would more time do? Sometimes more time will help solve the problem. Sometimes more time is only going to make it even more clear that there's something going on. So something to think about to guide your discussions. Another statement I hear going to schools, this comes up when it comes to hiring. When I was in school districts, I heard things like, I've been looking and looking and looking for teachers, and I can't find anybody who speaks Spanish. Do you have any candidates who speak Spanish that I can hire for my school? So again, this is one of those double-edged swords. Yes, it is wonderful to have bilingual teachers in your building so that students can communicate freely and they find people who are like them, people who look like them, people who have similar experiences to them, people who can relate to what they're going through and be an ear or a shoulder to lean on. But you do not have to know another language to be a wonderful teacher for a multilingual student. We have many, many, many monolingual English speaking ESL, English language development teachers who do a fantastic job. It's all about being trained in the right strategies. So, yes, it's a bonus to get a bilingual teacher, but don't hang on that as the solution. I've heard principals say, I hired a Spanish speaking algebra teacher. We should be good. Well, that's great. But if we don't know how to take that second language acquisition and put it into play in the classroom, it's still the same idea. So, another myth that's out there. Often heard as well is our ESL or ESOL or English language development. So many different things from district to district to district. But the English language development program, no matter what you call it, the instructional program, um, are intervention programs. So if a student is in an ELD program, an ESL program is being picked up or seen taught by the ESL teacher, then they're off the table when it comes to intervention because they're already in an intervention. That one is definitely a place where a civil rights violation can happen and a lawsuit can come up. Our core instruction, our language arts curriculum, math curriculum, whatever we're doing in the other content areas, ESL, they are all equal instructional programs, mandatory and equally weighted. So we can't say um, this student qualifies for intervention, but they're in ESL, so we're going to take them off the list. That's very, very touchy. Right? It's a scheduling nightmare. I get it completely. Civil rights law says that you develop criteria for identifying students for special services, whether it be like gifted and talented, accelerated learning, intervention, um, CTE programs, whatever it might be, that you have criteria for identifying those students, and language is not one of the deciding factors. Equal opportunity. So if a English learner has the same data as a native English speaker who qualifies for a reading or math intervention, then by law, they also qualify for that intervention. Now, if that intervention is appropriate for the student is another conversation, because some interventions may or may not work well until we get to a certain level of language development. We can't put a blanket statement on it. We can't say level one students, our newcomer students, beginner students can't be an intervention because they don't have enough language. Most of the time, that's good practice because you're probably right. You just don't know enough about them yet or know what they can do. But to put that out as a blanket rule would be walking a really shaky line of legality. So just keep in mind that students who are in an ESL program mandated by federal law, and they can also qualify for other services. Right, and this goes with what I just said. If a student is in an ELD program, they don't need to be in an intervention program. Well, they do if they qualify. So a student might be in an English language development program. Maybe they're an intermediate student. They might have been in school a couple years and their literacy is not progressing as you wish. Their data looks very similar to English speakers in an intervention program. Then they really do need to be considered for that intervention program equally. And again, some intervention programs are better than others for English learners because you have to know more about what's going on with them before you make that final decision. But remember equal access. All right, so now that we get the myths out of the way, let's talk about what do we do as a school when we have concerns about how students are being identified or if students are being identified, when students are being identified for special education. And I tend to see one way or the other. either a school is aggressive about saying we're jumping on it right away. We don't want to let these issues linger. We want to get right on it. And then we tend to over identify and have higher percentages of English learners in special ed than the average says is normal. Or we have schools who tend to say, we're going to wait. I don't know. I don't really want to touch that yet. We have to give it a year. Let's give it more time. And then we have significantly lower percentages of identified students, which is also a red flag that there's something not quite right in our identification program. Right. So again, always somewhere in the middle, right? Are we under identifying because we're being too cautious? Are we over identifying because we're being very proactive and aggressive? And what's in the middle? So step one is the education of the leadership team, the intervention teachers, the ESL teachers, the classroom teachers, right? We need to spend time with our everyone in the building talking about becoming an expert in language development and English language proficiency levels. When our school staff has a better understanding of proficiency levels and how language develops and the language development continuum, then we have a way better understanding of what's normal and what's not. Right? It's really hard to say that this is normal language development and this student, even though they're not reading where we want them to be and they're not up to our grade level expectations in third grade, and we are seriously considering intervention and beyond because they're not there and I want them to be there. If you are familiar with and you have some training and understanding around the English language proficiency levels and how that process happens and develops, you would be able to know to say, this third grader has been with us since kindergarten or pre-K. They have had great teachers, exposure to English. They have been in an ELD program for these 3+ years. We have tried different interventions and looking at their language development data, their access data, or their ELP 21 data, or their IPT data, whatever system you're using, and it's just stagnant. They're not moving. Or you see the scores went from this level to this level to this level to this level. Okay, there's growth. Is it enough growth? Is it normal growth? Are they moving in the right direction? Should we hold or should we jump on this? If you have a strong understanding of proficiency levels and how language acquisition works and what is normal at different times and phases and stages, then you will feel much more confident in saying, this is normal progress and let's hold because their language is developing. It just maybe isn't quite where we have our expectations for third grade literacy right now, but they are moving. Or you may say, I've looked at all that data. Their language is not developing. They've been stuck at the same level for 2+ years. Something isn't right. And you can say that with confidence. But to be able to do that, you need to be able to look at those scores, look at those proficiency levels, and get an idea of whether the progress that student is making is, I mean, I hate to say normal because it's different for every student, but along a predictable continuum, right? Are they following a predictable path or is this off what we normally see? And the more experience you have, the more you'll be able to say, this isn't quite how it usually works. On top of that, We have a lot of resources out there. Whether you are, no matter what state you're in, you have a set of English language development standards. And with those standards, you have proficiency levels. Usually, I think every one I've ever seen is between level 1 and level 5 or level 1 and level 6. And every set of scores and standards has some kind of descriptors that go with it. So, like Ohio has their own scores and standards and their own charts that say what those scores mean. These here are from the WIDA consortium because 30 plus states are in the WIDA consortium, so it hits a majority of our audience. Have documents that say how to describe what students are doing at each level. And if you see that a student is not moving on, then you have the education to say this might be an issue. Other states that use ELPA 21 or IPT or model or other assessments, everyone has some kind of set of descriptors. So your homework would be when you go back to school, start asking, what are my students' proficiency levels? How do I know their history? When did they start? Where are they now? How much progress have they made each year? And what do those numbers mean? So they're a 3 in reading. What is that? So they were a 1, a 1.2, a 3, a 4. Is that normal? Is it not normal? Find those resources, look at those resources, and get more knowledge around what those levels mean so you can feel more confident in saying when someone's stuck and when they're moving along well. If you're not sure what documents or what your state uses, feel free to send me an email and I will help get that to you because I think I've looked at most of them. You have my email if you're here, info@englishlearnerportal.com. If you need some help finding what you need, free to reach out and we can help connect you with the right documents. Going to a data meeting or a student teams meeting, whatever your school or district calls them, where the group comes together, has a representation of different specialty areas, and we talk about students we have concerns about. We call it lots of different things. In that conversation, if the student is in an ESL program, an English language development program, the language proficiency data must be part of the conversation. I have been to so many meetings where I'll say, what were their scores last year, this year, the year before? Does anyone have a copy? Can anyone tell me where they are right now? And so many times they're not included in the conversation. It has to be included because it's a major factor in whether or not the progress is, so-called normal or if there's an issue. So get familiar with what those scores mean. Another pitfall that I've seen often is making sure your team knows the local guidelines for dominant language testing and so on. Language dominance is usually what it's called. When you have students who speak multiple languages, you have to figure out which is the dominant language. And it's not always so clear cut because a lot of our students come into English when their first language is just barely even getting developed. I mean, you think about how much language does a 5-year-old have in their first language, and then we jump in with the second. So by third grade, we're not sure which language is stronger, which language is dominant. So make sure you know what those policies are. Start talking to those people well ahead of time to say, what do we do if we decide to go this route? Right? What do we need to follow? If you jump right into testing and assessments without following the particular steps, you can really create a lot of issues for your school. So make sure you know those guidelines and you know who are the people to reach out to when you need some advice about the bilingual assessment or what's available in your. As I was talking about the English language proficiency scores, again, knowing how to find that longitudinal data. Looking at one score is going to give you a picture. That picture is going to be a little skewed depending on your point of view. So we really want to bring to those meetings, or before we even get to those meetings, let's look at their entire history of English language proficiency course. So even if a student is behind where we want them to be for that grade level, whether it be writing, reading, general comprehension of what's going on in the content area. If we look at those scores, it gives us a huge clue. So let's say the student came in the middle of first grade to the United States, came into your school. They were brand new to English. So their scores were probably 1, 1, 1, 1. Listening, speaking, reading, writing, 1, 1, 1, 1. Brand new. Then you look at the second grade score, knowing they had, less than a year. And the scores are 2, 2, 1, 1, like listening, speaking, 2, 2, reading and writing, 1, 1. Okay, yes, as a second grader, we want them to be further with their reading, but progress is happening. So let's have the conversation about what we see. If we look at third grade data and you see listening 3, speaking 3, reading 2, writing 2, or something higher, yes, it still hurts our heart that they're not where we want them to be for that grade level, but they are making progress. They are learning language. And if there is some kind of special education related issue, it's not glaring. So we have to do a lot more digging and talking and investigating to make that point, because based on language scores, we're making progress. Now, by federal law, every state has to have a chart or some kind of organization that says how much progress a student will make each year. What's the expected growth? And it is all based on what grade level they enter US schools in. So if I come into school in first grade, this chart will tell me what's expected by second grade, what's expected by third, fourth, fifth, and so on. I know I'm using elementary grades, but the same would be true. If they come in sixth grade, it tells me where they should be by ninth grade. Now, it's not, in concrete that every student progresses this way, but a lot of research was put into developing those progress charts to show what we consider normal progression. So get your hands on your state's chart, compare your students' data to that. Are they making adequate progress in acquiring English according to what your state says? And that's great data to take into a meeting or into a conversation as well. Again, with parents also, the more facts and data you have comparing to what your state has researched and decided will be very helpful to include in the conversation. This seems kind of off a little in left field, but it is a huge barrier when it comes to dealing with these meetings that we are required to have, special education. Right? We really want to ensure that every staff member is comfortable interacting with parents from another culture. It's intimidating, and it's okay to say you're not comfortable. It's okay to say you don't know what to do or how to address them, or you don't want to offend anyone because the cultures are different and you're afraid to say the wrong thing. All of that is legitimate. But we have to involve parents from the very beginning so we develop those relationships, so that later, if a problem comes up or a concern comes up, we have trust and we have communication already in place. We are, again, by federal law, required to provide interpreters for any meeting that is going on. If you need to make a phone call to those parents to say you have concerns, start that as early as possible. The parents can give you so much information. If you start to have an inkling of a concern, have a parent conference with an interpreter, not a friend, not a family member, not a neighbor, not a teacher or ESL teacher you pull out of a classroom, a trained interpreter, and have that conversation with the parent about what their educational history is. What were they like in school, in your home country? You can learn so much. Parents will be honest most of the time. Pride comes in the middle sometimes, and parents will try to skate around it. Yes, of course, sometimes. But for the most part, parents will be honest and they might tell you, um, my student spent 3 years in first grade because they couldn't pass the test to exit first grade in my country. Or my child just stopped going because they weren't successful and the teacher didn't know what to do with them because there's not mandatory education in every country. They might say, no, my child communicates very well in the first language. They're my interpreter often. When they were in school in our country, they were reading, they were doing all these things. And again, between countries, we may have different grade level, age level expectations. So, what looked like a rock star in Guatemala may not be exactly what we are saying, in public school in Idaho, but you'll get an idea of whether there were concerns or not. Questions like, if you're talking about speech language pathologists, kind of articulation issues, things like that. Do their friends understand them? Do the family members have any trouble understanding? How do they pronounce things? Have those conversations with the parents early. I have been in too many meetings where we get to the meeting to start talking about an IEP, and it's really the first time that the parent understands what's going on here, right? So we have to make sure we're explaining the process, we're explaining how this works in the United States because it is different from anything they've experienced. So making sure those things are in place. So before we start looking at identifying students for a special education program, we want to do everything we can to prevent getting to that point. How do we prevent that? Some of the things we already talked about: knowing the data, knowing what it means, understanding language development, including the parents. All of these things are great preventative measures. What else can we do? Understand the connection between oral language development and literacy. This should be a part of every primary grade teacher's work every year, is understanding this connection. It doesn't end at primary grades though, because we have students coming in at all different grade levels and all different literacy levels. We have students coming in as 18-year-olds with low literacy levels. We have students coming in at 12, at 8. We have students coming in at high literacy levels. The connection between oral language development and literacy development is very well documented. Even in the world of farms, poverty, research around students of poverty, that oral language development is a key factor. And it boils down to, probably too simplified, but it boils down to, if they can talk about it, if they can say it, if they can express it out loud, then chances are much higher they are going to be able to put it into writing and they're going to be able to read what they wrote or what someone else wrote. That oral language practice is practice for literacy. If I can't say it, if I don't understand it when someone says it to me, I'm really going to struggle with reading and writing it. So making sure there is time in the day for ample conversation, for modeling for students how to have those academic conversations, to look at the way texts are arranged and how they're worded and the way the sentences are built, and mimic that back in your instruction and your modeling and everything you're doing in the classroom so that you are front loading all of that language. Oral language development. If I could go to a school and do one workshop in every every school, it would be this: oral language development strategies. It will make a huge difference if you work on the oral language before you move to the literacy, those scaffolds and supports. So make sure your tier 2 instruction is full of oral language development. Classroom teachers, ESL teachers, media specialists, even, the lunch ladies can get involved. Oral language, right? Mandatory by federal law, must happen. And so, in order to avoid a lot of cases of intervention and over identification, we need to make sure that our instruction is solid. We have teachers who are trained to work with English learners, teachers who understand language development and how it works. We have teachers who really know their curriculum and what's most important to get across. And we have dedicated time for English language development. And this can be a sticky subject, and this tends to be where I will get pushback in visiting new schools to say, oh, yes, the ESL teacher goes into the classroom and walks around and helps, or the ESL teacher has intervention groups, or the ESL teacher, when students don't finish their work, then they take that with them into the ESL teacher to help them finish or to tutor. And that approach is going to push more students toward intervention because they are not getting the balance program that is required for them. You must have explicit language development instruction. You must have English language development standards that you're addressing. Conquer, not repeat. You have your English language development teacher who is the expert, right? Absolutely the expert in language development, hopefully, if you're hiring well. So let that person have the time and the space to do what they do. So having the classroom teacher doing phonemic awareness and phonics instruction, and then asking the EL teacher to follow up and do another round of that is not usually making the most of your instruction, right? It's usually just giving more of the same. We need well-rounded. So someone can tackle those early literacy skills. Someone is tackling the oral language development skills, and we want to put all of this package together to make the most. All right, so what we normally do in our monthly webinars is provide a few minutes for the group to collaborate, amongst yourselves, share examples of what's working for you, where your frustrations lie, what questions you still have lingering. So I am going to open breakout rooms for about 5 minutes. If you are interested in participating in those conversations with colleagues, feel free to do that. If you do not want to participate in a breakout room and you want to hang out for us to debrief that in the end, that is fine also. And if you need to go, you can do that as well. So just for anybody who needs to go, I completely appreciate you taking the time with us tonight and dedicating your time toward our students. And I will be here till 8 o'clock. If anyone has any questions, feel free to jump into the breakout rooms if you want to have discussion with colleagues.